Welcome. We are so glad you joined us for our spring webinar series covering the invasive and smelly Callery pear. I'm Tammy Thompson, Outreach and Conference Manager for Deep Roots, and I'm delighted to spend the evening with you, at least the next hour with you. Before I turn it over to our Executive Director, I want to do a few announcements. First of all, we are incredibly grateful for the Alvin L. Gottlieb Foundation and the Missouri Department of Conservation for their sponsorship of this webinar. This webinar will be recorded and up on the Deep Roots website within about 24 hours. You'll also receive an email with the link and resources mentioned during this broadcast. We have a few upcoming events that we'd like to draw your attention to. Native Plants at Noon occurs every third Thursday of the month. We tour Missouri Department of Conservation site, exploring the native plants and the natural areas. In April, we're going to go to the Big Buffalo Creek Conservation Area in Benton County, Missouri. And we're really excited to see the spring ephemerals and all of the things that area can show us. Also in April, we have a native plant sale on April 23rd from 10 to 2. We will have some amazing vendors, a food truck, and the Callery Pear buyback event there for the Kansas side. And speaking of the Callery Pear buyback event, we are now accepting registrations for this event, and quantities are limited. It's a program to incentivize cutting down a Callery pear tree. Just register, cut down a Callery pear tree, and send us a picture, and we will give you a free native tree. We have 2 event locations, one for Kansas and one for Missouri. All of our events, including registration for the Callery Pear event and webinars, are on our website at www.deeproots.org/events. During the program today, if you have questions, please note those in the Q&A tool on Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can during the panel. I'll be using the chat to send you links and references mentioned during the webinar. With that, I'm honored to introduce Deep Roots Executive Director, Stacia Stelk. Get us started on this valuable topic, Stacia.
Tammy, thank you so much. What a great introduction. I am the one who is honored to be a part of this amazing team and to be on a line with the guests we have lined up this evening. So good evening and welcome. Tonight's webinar is a story of unintended consequences. We've all experienced them, both personally and in our society. I once house trained a dog to ring a hanging bell on our door when he was ready to go outside. It was awesome for about 5 minutes. Then he started ringing whenever he saw a squirrel, when he wanted a change of scenery, and when he got bored. Not exactly the plan we had in mind. As a society, we widen interstates to accommodate rush hour traffic and reduce slowdowns. And when construction is complete, more commuters use the road, and congestion is the same as it was before. Finally, as homeowners, many of us have turf grass, which needs water, aeration, overseeding, and chemicals to survive in our climate. Oh, and it also needs to be mowed regularly with expensive equipment or by a hired and also expensive service. The story of the Callery pear is one of unintended consequences. And tonight we will learn from experts the history and folly of this tree species, what happens when it escapes your backyard, and it will, and what we can do about it. Our first speaker is Ryan Armbrust. Ryan is the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator with the Kansas Forestry Service, where one of his duties has been to lead the agency's efforts addressing invasive plants. He lives in the Flint Hills of Kansas, a unique and beautiful ecosystem. Unfortunately, it's also just beginning to be threatened by the Callery pear. And so with that, I will welcome Ryan to our virtual stage to tell us a few stories. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stacia. Let me see if I can go ahead and get my screen shared for everybody here. Bear with me. Things are processing. There we go. All right, so absolutely, Stacia's right. We're dealing with unintended consequences of an otherwise pretty impressive tree in terms of its resiliency, in terms of the number of things it does. But I think it's worth taking a look back to see how did we get to where we are. I'll go ahead and out myself as not just a forester, but sort of a history nut too. And hopefully you can bear with me, because we're going to kind of take a dive back in time here for a moment to find out how we got to where we are. And ultimately, I'm going to share a little bit about what I think we can do about it. And then I'll hand the baton off to a couple of my other esteemed colleagues on the webinar tonight. But without further ado, Callery Pear in Kansas. And I would highlight that Kansas is certainly not the only state dealing with this. Obviously, we know that Missouri is, but we're in, for better or worse, good company with a lot of other states who've been wrangling with this. But it's interesting that we're at this point, because clearly we all recognize now something is happening here. That hasn't always been the case. I'm not that old, but I remember very distinctly not that long ago getting laughed at when people would, when I would say, I think Callery Pear is going to be a problem. They'd say, there's no way. It's a sterile tree. You're nuts. I remember thinking about early 2000s that basically the tree just stunk, literally stunk. That was the worst thing I could say about Callery Pears for the most part, that I didn't like the way they smelled. Started to get some reports. We were hearing from some people who were, keeping a keen eye on observing what was going on in the system around them, saying, I think I'm starting to see some seedlings here and there. That's sure strange for a tree that's allegedly doesn't produce viable seed. There was a nursery owner that when I was working in Nebraska, north of Kansas City, that was starting to see some seedlings they thought along the creek. And we thought, that's sure curious. A couple years later, the photo on the right here is actually from a waterway in Lincoln, Nebraska. We said, well, how about that? We've got some Callery Pear down there. At first you think white flowers, maybe it's just wild plum, but no, that Callery Pear down in that waterway. Shortly after that, I took a job here in Kansas, where I'm at now, and started to see suspicious white blooms. Now, I'm used to seeing white blooms in the spring, wild plums along our roadways, and I like to mark those, make a mental note, go back, in August and September when the fruit's ripening to go pick some to make jam, but these certainly weren't wild plums. Start to look around a little bit more. By 2014, I'm noticing this is real. This is starting to get worse. We're starting to see this a lot of places. It's not just here and there. It's not just in old nurseries. Something is happening here. We're not sure what the dynamic is, but something's clearly happening. By 2018, we finally have achieved sort of full buy-in from a lot of our partners here in Kansas. We can all agree that at least we should no longer be recommending this tree, that the cons at this point are pretty strongly outweighing the pros of an otherwise pretty tough tree. The last couple of years, as we started to lean into it a lot more, we wrote a grant to intensively map where Callery Pear infestations are actually occurring throughout Kansas. Spoiler alert, it's all over the place. I've got a map I'll show you in a few more slides here of where we found it, but you start to look for it and you start to find it everywhere. And I'm sure my colleagues over in Missouri have a similar story of when you started to look and you trained your eye to see it, you kind of had that moment of, oh my goodness, this stuff is everywhere. What are we going to do? This last year, we were fortunate enough to work with a national field trial to do some herbicide replications on some plots to see what can we actually do about it. And we'll have a publication coming forth soon with some real world recommendations on what we found to be effective. But I'll make a couple of allusions to what we found effective here at the end of the presentation. But this is one of the first places where I really had my eyes open to this. This is just from Google Earth. It's amazing when you could see invasive plants from space, by the way. But this is just for a Google Earth comparison. Same place in Lenexa. I'm not going to identify, who manages this land or anything like that, but just in Lenexa. I remember driving past here at one point, sometime between 2011 and 16, and going, what in the world is going on over there? And you can see starkly here, we have a lot of conversion of an undermanaged land there with a lot of Callery Pear. You can actually see some of the white blooms. The 2016 shot was early enough in the season, March or April. You can see the white flowers there. This wasn't the only spot. I can find pictures like this from all over Kansas. Here's a few of them. This is just outside of Mays, Kansas, northwest of Wichita. It's a fall picture, but just in the course of 10 years, we went from having nothing out here to pretty solid Callery Pear. These are pretty mature trees already. By the time they get this large, they're putting out lots and lots of fruits. So these aren't just taking over this landscape, they're serving as a massive seed source for adjacent landscapes. Well, here's down just by El Dorado, another rangeland, and all of a sudden we've got a whole lot of woody plant material showing up here. Again, some of this is eastern red cedar, honey locust, probably some hedge. The majority of this is Callery pear. Ottawa, same story, undermanaged landscape. All of a sudden, over the course of 8 years here, it went from just a few scattered plants to a whole lot of woody plant material out there. Here's one in Topeka. You can see how highly managed this parkland was, with a lot of mowing. Just a couple of years, letting the gas off the mower there, and all of a sudden you have significant numbers of Callery pear coming in there. Then, of course, here is in Johnson County, a similar situation where we had pretty much nothing within this pasture land. And then about every single one of those green dots on the right side there in the course of 7 years is now a large Callery pear. And you can see this if you just drive around on the highways throughout Kansas and probably throughout Missouri as well. You start to see, especially this time of year, we have a late spring this year, so maybe it's pushing it a little bit further, but I know in Southeast Kansas right now, late March is a perfect time to see this. You can do Callery pear surveys at highway speed where you see this stuff show up. Nice white flowers by the side of the road. This is by Chanute. Here's one over by Sycamore, Kansas. Here's another one by El Dorado, just off the turnpike. Here's a really stark one over by Arc City. And this is pretty typical for all across Kansas at this point. And this has happened pretty rapidly, where we've seen this conversion over just about the last 10 years of really having to hunt for this stuff to be able to find it everywhere. So this is an example I'll mention here. This is not far from me, Geary County, Kansas, here in the Flint Hills. This is adjacent to an old nursery. And I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive to show you what it looks like actually under this stuff when we have advanced infestation. So down ground level, you do have a little bit of grass still left at the edge of this, and you can see sort of a early invader right there in the middle of the grass. And it doesn't take very long for that to become canopy closed, and you essentially have a desert underneath this stuff. So as you try and push into this, you'll see just almost nothing underneath. You'll have a bunch of Callery pear leaves. You'll have bare ground. You'll have a few straggling bits of grass that are still trying to hang on. But for the most part, this becomes essentially a desert. There's nothing under there. You're not going to have any wildlife really using that. You're not going to have many insects. You're certainly not going to have this sort of biodiverse plant material you would assume you're going to have them in the Flint Hills with all kinds of native grasses and forbs. I want to show this picture. This is a park in Topeka, and at first glance, this actually is pretty aesthetically pleasing. It looks pretty nice. But I want to highlight here, instead of showing where the invasive Callery pear is, I'm going to highlight just with some green there. That's pretty much the only trees in this shot that aren't Callery pear. Everything else, obviously except the grass, is a Callery pear. So this has gone from otherwise functional grassland with a few trees to becoming a monoculture of Callery pear really rapidly. So again, I want to pull back and think, okay, this is where we're at now. We can all probably recognize that we have a ton of Callery pear out there. Oh my gosh, this is taking over. How do we get to this point? So I want to pull back and look at the historical view here, because Callery pear, obviously, it's an invasive plant, wasn't always here. One of the components of being invasive means it has to be non-native to that ecosystem in question. So where did it come from? Well, it came from Asia. It's a well-adapted plant from a similar sort of continental climate in Asia. That's why it does so well here. It was selected because it would do well. It was selected because there was a problem with fire blight on edible pears, the horticultural crop that you get in the supermarket. There's a problem with fire blight on that. So really well-meaning researchers found a species that was very resistant to fire blight, very tough, very drought resistant. It was honestly just a great solution to the problem they identified. So in 1909, it was brought over by some plant explorers from the Arnold Arboretum associated with Harvard University. By 1916, it was released as an official release from the USDA for use in grafting for these edible pears. But by 1950, people were realizing there's some ornamental value to this crop that we're just using as a rootstock. Maybe we should pursue something with this. It has these white flowers. It gets some fall color. It is really tough. And I'm telling you, a lot of people will still grow Callery pears out in Dodge City and Garden City out in Western Kansas, and you've got to be a tough tree to succeed there. So this is a tree that really it was a great solution for the problem they were having. And what's more, they said, we have this clonal cultivar we're going to release called Bradford. We really like it because it's self-sterile. It doesn't produce fruit. It doesn't have thorns. We're going to plant it everywhere. In fact, we're going to plant whole rows of it all over the place, nothing but Bradford. And then we kind of sat there for a long time. The problem with Bradford, of course, if you've ever seen old Bradfords, is they peel like a banana. You get a heavy snow load, you get a wind load. This is a super common sight. It's recognized as this is going to be a problem. We can't continue to promote Bradford everywhere. So never fear, we can always release more cultivars. We can improve those branching angles. We can go from having really narrow branching angles with included bark to much wider, stronger branch angles here. And we had New Bradford, Chanticleer, Aristocrat, Cleveland Select, which I think is actually the same as Chanticleer, Red Spire, White House, Stonehill. It goes on and on and on, all kinds of new cultivars. But here's the key. All those new cultivars are now new genetic material. So instead of being a self-sterile cultivar that's a clone Bradford all over the world, now we have diverse genetics out there. It can cross-pollinate. Thus, we get to where we are now. We have lots of fruit being produced. That fruit has been cross-pollinated. It's got viable seeds. All it takes is a bird to eat it, do its thing, and we have seedlings. So one of the features that this cultivar was promoted for, right when it was released, this is a press release that was in the New York Times of all places. I don't know if the New York Times still runs press release about new cultivars, but in January 1964, it has this press release that says, Bradford pear has many assets. I would agree. I think it also has a lot of liabilities at this point, we recognize. One of the assets was saying it has abundant fruits. They're the size of small marbles. They're considered an asset after leaves have fallen. And they're saying if they're not eaten by birds or squirrels, the pears dry up and disappear. There's none of the objectionable littering common with other fruiting trees, things like crab apples, things like plums, all of these other fruiting trees they'd have for their flowers. So they recognize, yeah, there's some fruit on this, but don't worry, it's not a concern. Well, I'm not going to blame the New York Times, but I am going to say that it turns out it is a concern. So we continue to have this plant be promoted, even though we know this is a concern. And Callery pear isn't the only one that has entered the ranks of invasive plant concerns from the horticultural trade. And that's not necessarily to say the horticultural trade is a bad actor, but by no means. A lot of times we have unintended consequences that happen well down the road from what was otherwise a pretty thorough assessment of benefits and drawbacks to a plant. But we do know that now this is a concerning plant. And these are just a few tags that I pulled that off of online websites today. I kind of tried to hide exactly who is selling these, to protect the innocent and not so innocent. But Callery pear is still continue to be promoted and sold. And so I would just caution everyone, please don't plant them. And if you have an otherwise wonderful garden center or nursery you're working with, maybe take a moment and try to have the conversation about it may not be in the best interest to continue planting this plant, even though it's a reliable performer. So I mentioned earlier that we in Kansas had this intentional effort to try and map where Callery pear was. And honestly, this started from me being in a place where a lot of people didn't believe me that I see it all over the place. And I had anecdotal accounts and photos, and I could say, gosh, I know I've seen it in your county. People would say, yeah, I don't think it's there. I think you're seeing things. So we worked with our Department of Agriculture and helped pay for a part-time technician to actually go and do what we call a quarter county survey. So we had someone drive up and down county roads and make at least several survey points in each quarter of a county in Kansas. And long story short, you can look at the map and see that every county we looked in, and this was for eastern half Kansas, every county looked in except for 3. And I think if we went back and looked in those 3, we'd find it again. We found infestations of Callery pear. And this doesn't just mean we saw a tree growing in the park. It means we saw small seedlings in a ditch somewhere. We saw a grove somewhere that it clearly wasn't planted, wasn't a maintained landscape tree. So it's not that some of the white spots in this map don't have it. They just maybe didn't do such an intensive survey as we tried to do. This was just last year that we completed this survey. So long story short, it's out there, it's everywhere. We know how it got there. We know how it's going to continue to spread. So that kind of prompts the question, okay, now what do we do about it? And I would just take a couple minutes and share a few of the strategies that we've been looking at in Kansas, because In some cases, the resources we're concerned about in Kansas are similar to other folks. And in some cases, there's a little bit of difference there. And I might be a little bit biased just because I live in the Flint Hills, but I think preserving our tall grass prairie, which is unique and very important, I think is worth quite a bit of effort here. So how do we kill it, right? Well, the way we tend to kill woody plants in the tall grass prairie is with fire. Works really well. It is the main factor why we have functional prairie ecosystems that have lasted and lasted to this day, because of the routine use of fire in a fire adapted ecosystem. Well, what we found is that Callery pear, boy, you really can't kill it with fire very effectively. So here's an image. I'm going to go ahead, and I see actually Matt Garrett is joining us. I've got to give credit where credit's due, that this is actually Matt and his team. They routinely do prescribed fire in Shawnee Mission Park, which is wonderful. That's one of the ways that they help preserve their ecosystem. We routinely do the same thing here in the Flint Hills. This is just last spring, one of my neighbors burning their pastures. Most of these folks burn their pasture every single year, every spring. Maybe they do a 3 or 5 year rotation, but for the most part, they'll run fire across this about April 15th every year. Well, unfortunately, this does an okay job of controlling most woodies, especially eastern red cedar, but it really doesn't tend to touch the Callery pear. So as an example, this is a pasture pond just a couple miles from my house. I drive past this almost every day. Over the last few years, I've noticed significantly more woody plant material around this pasture pond. And I can tell you for sure, the guys who burn this, they'll run a big head fire across this every spring. It's not for lack of heat that they're putting on the ground that these things aren't being controlled. So just to kind of help pick out what we're looking at here, this is a lot of green. Everything I circled in red there is a Callery pear, and there's more. This is essentially probably 70 or 80% Callery pear vegetation out there, and it's going to push out everything else that's out there. It's going to push out the dogwood. It's going to suppress the cottonwood regeneration, the willows, the things that we maybe want out there in that sort of wet pasture pond area. And you can see some of those are getting further out into the grass. They're going to continue to get out there into the grass. One of the reasons that there's so much right here is that we have that big cottonwood. It's a great place for birds to roost right after they've eaten some Callery pear fruit and deposited the seeds. So I'll show just a few slides here of some of the management strategies that we've tried to have here that do have some potential of working well, because fire alone isn't going to cut it, which is really tough because fire alone is such a good way of managing things for us in the Flint Hills, but fire alone isn't going to touch this. So we did a project a couple of years ago where we worked with a forestry contractor who went through with a really impressive forestry unit on the front of his skid steer. It could just go and take down an entire, 12, 14-foot Callery pear right down to the ground. Had a couple of folks walking right behind that and spraying the cut stumps. The takeaway from this is that what we found is that mechanical control by itself does not work. Unless you mow every single year, like in a utility right away, a street right away, something like that, the Callery pear is going to come back. Just simple mechanical mowing is only going to make that Callery pear angry. It really re-sprouts from roots so strongly that just mowing isn't going to work. And even mowing and immediately following up with chemical only works to achieve partial control. You've really got to stay on top of this. As an example, here's an old nursery. We could see just 2 years after they stopped mowing it routinely, every one of those little green things in between those older rows of mature trees, you guessed it, it's Callery pear. And I can tell you, this isn't just from aerial view. I've walked this and I can verify this is it. In fact, this is where we did that project. And I can show you, this is that cycle we get when you just do mowing alone. So you go from mowing, it looks great. You've really knocked all that stuff down, to in the upper right-hand corner there, you see, boy, we got a lot of sprouts coming back. A year later, you've got a lot of root sprouts coming back, and all of a sudden they're 2-3 feet tall. And this will ultimately just go right back to where it was at if you don't follow it up with some sort of herbicide application afterwards. So without delving too deep into herbicide recommendations, I will say, first, always read the label, always wear PPE. The label is the law. But in general, I would say we've got different options here. One, foliar sprays can work, but you have to keep in mind that it has a thick, waxy leaf, and you're going to want some sort of surfactant or something like that to really get control there. Where foliar might work really well is as a follow-up to mechanical control. There are some direct applications you can do from basal bark sprays, which can work very well, and you can do all times a year, but it could be a consideration when you have many, many, many stems. Hack and squirt and cut stump, we found in our study, were both extremely effective. Near 100% control on those, but again, high labor, very intense. Way better. My overall recommendation: try and take care of this stuff very early. By the time you get an advanced infestation, you're really going to struggle with controlling this. It's going to be really, really tons of labor on this. So I just want to show a couple pictures real quick here. This is part of that project, doing some cut stump treatments. We did a cut stump treatment in June. Real quick, zip that thing off with a pruning saw, sprayed it just on the cut surface. Came back a year later, or at the end of the growing season, we had no resprouts on any cut stump treatments we did. Similar with a hack and squirt treatment, where you basically just hack into the cambium with an axe or a machete, spray a little bit of herbicide on there. We come back several months later into the growing season, no regrowth, dead as a doornail. So these we found really work well. And we hope to have a publication with some of these specific recommendations coming out pretty soon here. So I'll wrap it up right here. And if you have any questions, I would say, absolutely, please ask some questions at the end of this presentation. We'll have some time after my colleagues have gone. But please follow up with me, especially if you're in Kansas. If I get an email from someone in Missouri, I'll respond. I'm not going to discriminate, but especially if you got any questions in Kansas, please go ahead and follow up with me. And I'd love to talk about how we can kill this pest.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, Ryan. Our next speaker is Matt Arndt. Matt is a consulting forester and arborist, having owned and operated Matt's Healthy Woods and Wildlife since 2015. He carries certifications from both the Society of American Foresters and the International Society of Arboriculture. I'm sure I just butchered that name. Matt, please correct me. Matt has served as president of the Missouri Consulting Foresters Association since 2013, is the chair of the vice chair of the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force, and is president of the Cameron, Missouri Park Board. Thank you, Matt, for joining us, and I'll let you take the stage.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just to follow up on a few things that Ryan had said, my experience, the best way to find the best time of year to find a new infestation of Callery pear is in that late fall, when you have the fall color, because those sprouts won't have bloomed yet. If you wait to look for it in spring, then those plants have at least gotten up and had those first couple years growth before they actually flower. So the earliest time that you can find those in the field edges, the old fields, the CRP fields, the pastures, are the fall, and focus on looking for the red leaves. They turn that burgundy color, almost a red wine color, late into fall. So that would be the primary time that I would search for those. I find it rather interesting. I've done a few invasive species presentations, and Ryan's set of slides on essentially how Callery pear became invasive. How do you have a sterile cultivar become invasive? I have a very similar full set of slides. I left in just a couple for this talk today, and as Ryan touched on, everything started with the Bradford cultivar, which is sterile within the cultivar. The pears have to have two individuals to be able to pollinate. Essentially Bradford and all of the individual cultivars are a clone of one single individual. So it's a single genetic line. So Bradford among Bradfords is completely sterile. I picked out Chanticleer, but again, as Ryan pointed out, there's quite a few additional cultivars. Every cultivar is sterile within that cultivar. And the problem becomes when those trees are in the landscape next to each other, they're not sterile between cultivars. So that's where the problem has really come as the plant genetics folks have been looking for a better alternative to Bradford, which was an honorable goal, trying to eliminate some of the breakage aspects and the problems with Bradford. Developing these newer and even more perfect trees has actually led to a major problem because of the ability for cross-pollination. So I didn't have all of the Google Earth photos or the local photos. I instead went to Google, and I found it very interesting. I decided just to clip out the actual Google search images page. You can see up in the corner, Callery pear, Missouri is what I typed in, and this is the first set of photos that comes in on Google. And every single one of them is a reference to the invasiveness of Callery pear. That to me speaks a lot to the level of infestation, not only in Missouri, but across the landscape. When they're, even the photos that appear to be advertising a nice pretty tree in the landscaping, you read the tagline under this one, it says foul smelling trees. This is actually an article in the Sturgis, Michigan newspaper referencing some of the Callery pear buyback programs that we've done here in the Midwest. But to me, that was a very telling feature. So I decided just to let Google do all the work right there and just show that. So some of the efforts that we've been doing on the Missouri side are specifically through the Missouri Invasive Plant Council. As Stacia said, I'm the vice chair of that group. Anything, if you have interested in MOIP, the moinvasives.org is the website. I'll show a few pages from our website, different features through this talk, but just a little bit of history on the Invasive Plant Council. It's created in 2015, spearheaded by Grow Native, along with a few other partners. There's a list of current member organizations. I represent the Missouri Consulting Foresters Association on the council. And as we've been working along, one of our first projects was an invasive plant assessment. So instead of the grant funded the county by county individual mapping that Ryan showed, and if that level of investigation was done in Missouri, we would have similar coverage as Kansas. I would be surprised if there's 10 counties in Missouri that would not be colored in that same map if we had the same level of effort to be able to map that. It's everywhere and rapidly expanding. So the invasive plant assessment was a multi-year project, involved reviews by a number of professional ecologists, biologists, people in the native plant tree field that gave reviews, separated the state into 6 ecoregions, combined the number of reviewers with the number of species reviewed with the 6 ecoregions, and we had not quite 2,000 individual reviews. One of the data sets that came out of that was a map for each species, showing the estimated level of impact to the environment, to the natural systems, the abundance of the plant, and the trend of the expansion in population. And you can see the impact is primarily northern and southwestern Missouri, where and that comes along pretty closely with the observed trend. Abundance more so, what I have observed is in the Springfield area, in pasture country parts of Missouri, you will find a little bit more abundance, but farther up in northwest Missouri, as we get into a little bit more fertile soils, a little bit less rock, it can have a greater impact on the systems. So one of the other products that came out of the assessment was a list of top invasive plants. We combined the regional reviews for abundance, trend, and impact, put those together in a weighted formula, and Callery pear came out as the #1 invasive plant in the state of Missouri. And you can see it's in pretty good company there with the other species just on the top 15 portion of that list. But that, again, it speaks to the EdMaps that Ryan showed does not give the full story of the current problem with Callery pear in Missouri. And MOIP had put together a set of 10 posters, essentially alternatives to Callery pear. We call them the plant this, not that posters. This one's for serviceberry, downy serviceberry. A native species has very similar flowering display in the spring and fall color. But there's a full set of 10 posters available through the MOIP website. And then the latest thing, and something that we definitely want to plug that we had done, is we started a Callery pear buyback event. I believe this will be MOIP's 3rd year, if I remember correctly, potentially the 4th, but I think the 3rd year working with Callery pear buyback events. We started with one event with 50 trees in St. Louis, and that has turned into multiple cities across Missouri. And we've actually had several other states reach out and use this event as a model for things that they can do in their own state. So the events that we have coming up here quickly, You can find the sign up both through the Deep Roots website or the Mow Invasives website. The pages are linked from both, but Columbia, Cape Girardeau, Joplin, Kansas City, both on the Missouri and the Kansas side, and then St. Louis and Springfield. And starting just a few years ago with one event for an afternoon in St. Louis, we're expanding pretty well to this point. And like I said, we also had we've had several other states reach out and actually ask for guidance and recommendations on how we got to this point. I'm not going to say that all of these states had, but again, just through a quick Google search, Callery Pear buyback event without Missouri, these 7 states all came up with headlines describing their bounty programs or their buyback recall programs. So that's all that I have got. Stacia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we have reached that portion in our evening when we are getting ready to do our panel discussion. First, I want to thank Ryan and Matt for sharing the history of the Callery Pear, the devastation it causes in natural areas, how to stop the spread, and the success and availability of the Callery Pear buyback bounty recall campaigns. This last portion of our evening is devoted to a panel discussion with Ryan, Matt, and a new guest, Matt Garrett. As a field biologist for the Johnson County Park Recreation District, Matt is responsible for management of wildlife, fisheries, and 8,700 acres of natural areas. Matt has extensive experience in large-scale prairie restoration, native seed collection, volunteer management, and prescribed fire. Say that 10 times fast. Welcome, Matt Garrett. As we go into this panel discussion, may I please remind you to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A feature on your screen. And if you see a question that you like, please vote it up so we know it's very popular. And so our first question is, as I jump in, and Ryan, you all very helpfully already answered this online, but I'm not going to ask it live because I'm sure it's not the only person asking this. What is the difference between Bradford and Callery?
I could re-answer that if we want, but
Please do.
Yeah, so Bradford is simply just a designated cultivar. That means someone found an individual seedling one time, said, man, this seedling is great. I'm going to take this seedling's genes and spread it over the world. So they did a clonal selection of just that individual seedling, called it Bradford, and every Bradford that's out there, if it was propagated true to name, is exactly the same genetics as that original seedling someone found in a seedling bed somewhere. So Callery Pear is just the whole species. Every Pyrus calleriana that comes from a seed, every one of those that I showed in one of those photos I had, those are all Callery pears. The individual parent plant in the first place may have been a Bradford. It was cross-pollinated with Aristocrat or Cleveland Select or something else. Or importantly, it could have been cross-pollinated now with some of those wild pears that are growing out, because every one of those wild pears now is different genetically, and it could have cross-pollinated that Bradford pear. The resulting progeny of Bradford and whatever else is just a Callery pear. Unless someone for a crazy idea went out to one of these fields, said, boy, I really like this one because it's got extra long thorns and stinks really bad. I'm going to call it, the worst. And if you selected every one of those and, grafted every one of those, you'd have a new cultivar you could call the worst.
Excellent, thank you. So Carla asks, what herbicides work best? And does this product also work on autumn olive?
I would say which herbicides work best. There's not always a generic, this is the true answer. So I did, just anticipating that this question would come up. You just took away my screen share. I'm going to take it back. Here's a short list of species. These are not necessarily ones that I have personally tested. I believe all of these came out of Nebraska Extension weed control guide. So these are some recommendations given, like Ryan emphasized earlier, make sure that you read the label and understand the label requirements. Ryan or Matt, do you have any further on herbicide specifics?
Yeah, in the park landscape, those 4-inch diameter or less plants, we really like to use Pathfinder 2 in backpacks, and staff can spread out and absolutely basal spray a large area. and then we spread apart and do the machete work on the bigger ones. With sometimes we've used Tordon and some other species or some other selections, but we love basal work. It's really fast and allows us to move quickly through a pasture and move on. But Pathfinder 2 tends to be the name brand that we use quite a bit.
And for anybody that's not directly familiar with the terminology around herbicide applications, the basal bark treatment is essentially you wet the bottom 12 inches of the bark. The label instructions will tell you to wet it completely to the point of runoff, but don't allow any to get into the soil. So that's essentially, it's a non-removal method of killing the tree, and it is very effective, especially for small trees.
And over application can give you a small circle of death around the tree. So being really cautious with that kind of drip line of what you're doing is critically important.
Yeah, I might just tag on there real quick too. And I would say that there's a number of different chemistries that seem to be pretty effective at actually killing calorie pear. The important thing is getting, proper coverage, no matter your application method, of each individual tree, and just being systematic as you work your way through the landscape. If you miss a bunch of them because you're just kind of trying to hurry your way through and hit as much as you can, and you don't get good coverage, or you have a bunch of skips, you're ultimately going to have to come right back there and do it. So the chemistry is important to consider. Absolutely agree with both my colleagues here. I would say just make sure you're getting, good systematic coverage and work your way methodically through, whatever system you're out there trying to treat.
I muted myself. All right, so I'm going to ask a question here that is probably obvious to the panel. So if I had that tree, I do not have this tree, but if I had that tree in my backyard and I cut it down, I'd still have to treat it chemically? Or is this for more large scale? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see you nodding, Ryan.
Unless you want it to resprout. If you don't treat it chemically, the stump will resprout. If you were to use a stump grinder, that will eliminate the growth nodes and it won't resprout that way. So typically in a landscape setting, flush cut to the ground and chemical treatment, or stump grinder to remove the stump and major roots, either of those will eliminate the sprouting capability.
That's really helpful to know. I knew I would have to do that with honeysuckle. I didn't know, like someone associated with deep roots just had cut down three easily 18-inch diameter Callery pears, maybe last spring. And now I'm questioning, I don't know if they ground them, and I'm questioning whether or not they treated them with chemicals. So like a year later, is it too late to treat?
If it has resprouted, you could still cut the resprouts and treat each of those, or do a basal treatment. If it has not resprouted a year later, then it's not going to.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll reach out to her after this. That's helpful to know. Actually, I sent her an email today encouraging her to sign up for the buyback program. Matt, I know that Matt Arndt. Sorry, I almost put you on the spot too, Garrett. I know that last night you did a webinar talking about the Stop the Sale campaign. Can you talk a little bit about that? And it's tricky to, I know other states have banned them and other invasive species, and I know it's a complicated subject, but I'd be really interested to hear how MOAP is approaching that.
Yeah, we are midway through, it's turned into a multi-year effort. We call it the Cease the Sale idea, or Cease the Sale initiative. We're working with as many varied stakeholder partners as we can to develop a proposal that can have as broad scale support as possible. And the end goal is to eliminate the sale of a certain set of known invasive species. We're not intending to target every species that's known to be invasive in Missouri, but Callery pear I do expect is going to be one of the ones that are on the final list. And if you really pay attention at or visit a lot of local nurseries, very, very few nurseries in Missouri are still selling Callery pear. And I actually, a very, very encouraging item got passed along to me yesterday prior to the other webinar through feedback leading up to that. A gentleman associated with Grow Native in Missouri actually was able to contact the CEO of Home Depot last year, and that contact filtered down to regional purchasing reps, and Home Depot no longer allows the sale of Callery pear in Missouri based on that contact. So very big kudos to Home Depot for taking that step. and to the people that reached out and made that happen. So that's we had at the MOIP level, we had made a similar attempt with one of the other box stores and received a resounding no way, we won't stop selling that as long as it's legal. The only way that we'll stop selling is for it to be illegal to sell. So again, that's a very, very encouraging thing that Home Depot was willing to eliminate that. And I had a screenshot sent to me that if you try to order a Callery Pear in Missouri, on the website, it says not available for delivery in Missouri. So that's a good thing. But we're, like I said, we're midway in this process. We're working towards a proposal that we can hopefully pass off to legislators and have them sponsor it for state legislation that will limit the sale of known invasive species, and Callery Pear being one of the primary species on that list. You're muted again.
I'm doing that because I'm confident my dogs are going to start barking any minute. So we have a couple questions in the chat about the buyback bounty recall program and the species available and the size of the trees. The trees are 3 gallon and they're typically native trees, and typically like between serviceberry, red bud, oaks, I think some tulip trees in some areas. And that relates to a question, which is, what would the 3 of you recommend as an alternative to Callery pears for a suburban backyard or any part of the yard, I suppose?
I got to put on my diversity hat here for a second and say I don't recommend an alternative. I recommend considering 5 or 10 species, because we're always going to benefit from diversity out there in terms of varied wildlife, habitat, beauty, less exposure to insect and disease risks. So again, not one alternative, but I'd really like to see 5 or 10. And thankfully, at least for I can come up even for Western Kansas, where it's tough to grow trees, I can come up with several good alternatives. And if you live in Eastern Kansas or throughout Missouri, my goodness, you can grow whatever you want about there.
So this is another question that I anticipated and have a set of slides on native alternatives that I'll run through real quick. Number 1 on my list would be downy serviceberry. Like I said, it's as far as a direct replacement for Callery pear, it's got a very similar spring flowering display, very similar fall color. Benefit is you can actually use the fruit for jams, jellies, and pies. It's a really attractive tree, one of the first native flowering trees in the state. Next would be deciduous holly. It has persistent bright red berries. They're actually still on the trees. They fall off along with spring flowering. So you'll have a bright red berry all winter. The thing to point out with deciduous holly, it's also called possum haw. Only the female trees produce the fruit. So you'll need a male tree locally to be able to pollinate to allow the female tree to produce the fruit. One of my favorite shrubs is a 9-bark. It's named for the curling of the bark is said to resemble a number 9. I can't say that I've ever actually seen one that I thought, wow, look at that number 9 on the side of that tree. But this is a really good native shrub as a potential alternative. Get into some larger trees, the tulip tree. It's a native magnolia that we have. It just catches the boot heel as far as its native range in Missouri. This turns into a much larger tree, has the classic magnolia flowers, the very large, thick petaled flowers, more of a yellow orange than at least I typically think of for a magnolia. I typically think of them as pure white. Yeah, it's in this tree tends to stay more upright. It's tall, oval shaped. It doesn't spread nearly as much as an oak or a maple will. Another very interesting tree is a musclewood or American hornbeam. The structure of the wood itself, the bark has the appearance of a tensed muscle. It has long kind of sinuous ridges on it. Again, has good fall color. The musclewood will do best in filtered shade, morning sun, afternoon shade, not as well in full direct afternoon sunlight. Then a tree that I feel is certainly underutilized as an ornamental in Missouri is black gum. It's hard to beat the fall color display of a black gum. It's right up there with every sugar maple, red maple, and you'll have more variation in color typically than you will among the maples. Then a good classic is flowering dogwood. An interesting anecdote for the non-tree people, the flowers on flowering dogwood, the white part is actually a bract. That's not actually the flower. The little cluster in the middle is a cluster of several flowers. So the white are not actually flower petals, but rather the bracts. And then black haw or any of the other viburnums, good dense clusters of white flowers in the spring. Again, good fall color, purple berries on the black haws. And then a very interesting tree is yellowwood. It looks almost reminiscent of a beech tree with the real thin gray bark, long hanging panicles of white flowers in the spring. A really cool tree if you get a chance to see one. I've heard this described as one of the rarest native trees in the eastern US. And then silky dogwood is a good small shrub. The winter twigs will be very, very noticeably red throughout the winter on silky dogwood compared to some of the other dogwoods. Then a potential alternative to burning bush is the native eastern wahoo. The difference you can see in one of those top photos, the difference between burning bush and eastern wahoo is the wing burning bush has corky ridges all along the twigs where the wahoo does not. It's not going to be quite as dense as a ornamental burning bush, but it still has the brilliant fall in those neat seed capsules that split open. And then one vine, just for a little bit further diversity, is the Dutchman's pipe vine. This is not one that I've actually seen myself, but the first opportunity I get, I will likely buy one. And it's the host for the pipe vine swallowtail butterfly. So those are my preloaded trees, but I would also echo what Ryan said. Diversity is good. With a little bit of practice, you can drive through old neighborhoods and determine at what point in time the houses were built based on the trees that are everywhere, going from American elm to Siberian elm to silver maple to white ash, Callery pear, now to red maple. The monoculture plantings to me are no fun. Anytime I design a tree planting, it's always a multiple species planting.
And I think from other conversations I've had with you, this group is not only diversity, but it's also right tree, right place. Yeah. So Matt Garrett, I'm going to kind of throw this question to you because I think you've probably, as an urban naturalist, you've seen this the most. To what extent are urban home gardeners discovering Callery pear invasions in their neighborhoods? And if not directly in their neighborhoods, where would they be seeing them?
So our backyard suburban areas in Johnson County are pretty sanitized. When you're looking at our Johnson County environment, you've got turf grass and you've got these mulch volcanoes around these specific trees in these neighborhoods. The margins in the neighborhoods it's hard to find a place where these trees are going to fit in. It's the lots nearby. It's that future green field development adjacent. It's the former tree farm, 6 blocks over. It's the land around the airports, that's been sitting fallow. It's something that hasn't had disturbance for a few seasons where you're beginning to see the invasion happening. So in these traditional kind of suburban cookie cutter neighborhoods, there's really not a lot of the space in our community for them to pop up. It's these future build out sites. I know after the Great Recession, a lot of tree farms stopped producing and kind of went rogue, and you'll see a lot of those former facilities that have been belching out the Callery pears. So yeah, it's like I said, it's hard to find in the neighborhoods, but if you go down and around the corner to where the next Taco Bell is going to be, that's where you're going to find it.
Roads, interstate right of ways are
right.
Prime places in urban environments.
Right.
And I know that waterways are also like where I see a lot of honeysuckle invading. Is that also a place that a Callery pear might drop in?
Yeah, for sure. We spend a lot of time in our streamway corridors, the Coffee Creek corridor, the Mill Creek corridor, the Kill Creek corridor, breaking up into teams of natural resource technicians, scouring it because, yeah, we're finding it absolutely all over those kind of riparian zones through the paved trail networks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I do want to tell the audience that has joined us this evening that Tammy will be putting together materials, including the tree list that Matt just helpfully shared, the chemical recommendations from this team, and other ways to help solve this and get involved with invasive species removal and eradication. Can I dare say try efforts? As we're approaching the end, I'm going to kind of throw it to the panel. Is there anything you wish someone would have asked you?
I've got one I'll just throw out as a fun fact. The best thing I can say about Callery pears anymore is when you do cut it down, save the big chunks because it's pretty good smoking wood. That's about the nicest thing I can say about Callery pears anymore, other than I respect them because they're tough. But when you do cut them down, save some of that because it actually is pretty good. I've had some pretty good smoked pork butt with Callery pear wood.
And I used it for my home fireplace. We had one in my yard when we bought this house, and it fell victim to the first buyback event. But I still have the last few chunks on my firewood stack outside.
So Matt, what did you plant in its place?
We actually planted in that part of the yard some edible fruit trees. We've got a few apples, peaches, and cherries, a couple blueberry bushes, trying to keep the soil acidic enough to allow them to stay alive, and then a Norway spruce right next to it. The wife requires that we have something she can put Christmas lights on that are still up.
Well, it's still, the first quarter-ish of the year for a few more hours. Matt Garrett.
I'll say that convincing people to cut down these trees takes time. Even within my own agency, we went from going out after, the rogue wild trees, but the landscape pears were off limits, and these were part of the park landscape. And it took 7 to 8 years of lobbying, even internally within a park agency, for everyone to really understand the problem. And don't expect your neighbor or your friends to just immediately drop these trees. That it took quite a bit of education, even with park staff, to be ready to. This year I turned around, and in Shawnee Mission Park, they took down an alley of Callery pears that, there's 23 trees that, were full, mature, beautiful, long place where people were taking their family photos is gone because the staff finally understood how devastating it was for the region. So it takes time, and just talk to your neighbors and make it happen, but don't immediately expect them to grab the chainsaw and go Clark Griswold on it.
That's good advice.
And speaking to the potential list of replacement trees, I certainly was not intending that list as these are the only suitable replacement trees. There are any number. So I would encourage everybody to work with your local landscape nursery, and that they have a better feeling for soil conditions and what will do well in your exact part of whichever state you may be in than somebody sitting up here. So that would be always a good resource, is the local landscape nursery. And I would always encourage people to plant native trees first, but that's not to say that non-native, non-invasive trees are off limits.
Very good. Ryan, do you want to say anything about community foresters in Kansas and how they might be able to help recommend the right tree for the right place?
Yeah, absolutely. I made some reference to, we maintain preferred tree lists. We do have quite a bit of differences across the state of Kansas for what trees do well. We've talked about right tree in the right place quite a few times. So we've got about 5 or 6 recommended tree lists or preferred tree lists we maintain for different parts of the state. And if you're tuning in from anywhere in Kansas, we do have one of those lists. So you can just type in Northwest Kansas preferred tree list, Southeast Kansas preferred tree list, whatever part of the state you're in, or you can go to our website at kansasforest.org and check that out. And those are maintained by our community foresters. We've got district community foresters throughout the state of Kansas, and they work closely with, based on their own knowledge and expertise, with local extension agents, with the Kansas Nursery Landscape Association, others, to maintain lists of trees that are that check a lot of boxes, that are generally available, known to do well, and don't necessarily pose risks. Like I said, we've taken a few trees off our lists because we no longer, in good conscience, can recommend those trees, even with significant caveats. Similar to the way we've removed, ash trees from our list. We know ash trees do really well in Kansas until emerald ash borer destroys them. So for a lot of those same reasons, we keep those lists updated. So if you got any questions, especially if you're in a community, if you're with a community tree board or anything like that, and you're looking to update, what kind of trees you recommend for your community and make recommendations, whether that's to an HOA, to a municipality, whatever it is, please reach out to us. We're ready to help support those sorts of things. And even if you have identified, boy, we've got a bunch of Callery pear trees in a park, we'd like to remove them, but what do we replace them with? How do we write a plan for what we want to have there? That's certainly an area we'd love to help support you in.
Very good. And similarly, on the Missouri side, the Missouri Department of Conservation is a tremendous resource. Okay, well, we are just past 7 o'clock. So I do want to say thank you, Ryan, Matt, and Matt. This has not only been an informative evening, but I'm sure I'm not alone when I say I want to go chop down my neighbor's Callery pear tree. And this time I know that I need to treat it with a chemical as well. Thank you to everyone who tuned in this evening, and thank you for supporting the work of Deep Roots. If you or a friend has a Callery pear tree, please check out our Callery pear recall event that Tammy mentioned in the introduction. Removing that invasive species will earn you a free native 3-gallon tree. And remember, friends don't let friends plant or keep invasive species. Thanks again for joining us. And don't forget to sign up for our next evening webinar, which is Spring Native Plant and Wildlife Tour in Suburbia. Discover the life and activity of wildlife in spring through the keen eye of Elaine Hudlin, Wildlife Education Specialist with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. We'll return to a residential lawn teeming with native plants in an inner ring suburb, and Elaine will identify the plants and talk about the amazing birds, insects, and creatures that we can enjoy and support through the spring months with native plants, all in our own backyards. So have a great night, and thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.